So there's a part of this Iran report that barely made the headlines, and I need to explain it to you. Because while everyone's talking about strikes and retaliation, there's a specific reason this weekend was chosen. And that detail changes the entire calculation. Quick thing before we break it down. Drop the country you're watching from in the comments. I want to see where everyone's tuning in from today. I actually do read them. Here's what happened. Friday morning, CBS News broke a report that the United States and Israel are planning what they called one of the harshest bombing campaigns to date against Iran's energy infrastructure, power plants, oil refineries, the kinds of places that keep a country running, or in this case, stop it from running. And here's where it gets specific. According to multiple sources, this campaign could begin as early as this weekend. We're talking hours from now, Saturday, Sunday. And there was discussion about wrapping any military operation up before global financial markets opened on Monday morning. Think about that for a second. They are planning a major escalation in the Middle East, one that would target a nation's ability to produce electricity and fuel. And they're timing it so the stock market doesn't freak out until the opening bell rings in New York. Now ask yourself, does that sound like a military decision or a political one? But here's the thing I can't stop turning over in my head. President Trump hasn't actually given the final go-ahead yet. The reports say he's still considering it. So why are we hearing about it now? Why is this being leaked? Because wars aren't just fought with bombs. They're fought with headlines too. And someone wants us to know this is coming. Let me walk you back through how we got here. This conflict started back in February 28th to be exact. The US and Israel launched strikes on Iran, and it kicked off a 40-day war that basically never really stopped. There was a ceasefire, but it collapsed on July 8th. And since then, it's been tit for tat. Attack, retaliation. Attack, retaliation. And now, this. So what makes this different from the other strikes we've seen over the last few months? Easy. They're going after civilian infrastructure. That's a line. And someone is about to cross it. I should clarify, when the reports say energy infrastructure, they're not talking about military bases or missile silos. They mean power plants, refineries, the facilities that keep the lights on in Tehran, that run hospitals, that pump water, that let people cook food. They've reportedly discussed cutting off electricity across entire parts of Iran. And I just want to sit with that for a second. Because when you cut off power to a city of 8 million people, you aren't just hitting the regime. You're hitting everyone, every family, every child, every person who has nothing to do with the government's nuclear program. And I have to be honest with you, that bothers me. But let me put the politics aside for a second and just tell you what the sources are saying. CBS reported that this would be a joint U.S.-Israeli operation. And that's significant because it would mark the first time in weeks that Israeli forces have participated directly in strikes on Iranian soil. Up until now, it's been more, let's call it, coordinated. But this would be different. This would put both militaries in the same airspace, hitting the same targets at the same time. One Israeli official told CBS that Israel is unaware of a decision to restart full military operations and hasn't been asked to join any action. Now, is that true, or is that just words? The kind of thing you say when you want to keep your options open. Because other U.S. sources say Israel has been notified and is coordinating. So someone's not telling the whole truth here. Let me tell you what's really interesting, though. The Wall Street Journal reported something slightly different. They said President Trump did authorize a new offensive, one that could start this weekend and last for several days. But they also added that if Iran makes immediate progress on the diplomatic front, Trump might call the whole thing off. So the message is basically, we're coming for you unless you give us what we want. And we're going to leak it to the press so you know we're serious. Now, I can't prove that's what's happening here, but I've watched this long enough to know how the game is played. Let's talk about what Iran is saying, because they're not exactly sitting quietly. A senior Iranian security official told the semi-official Tasnim news agency that Tehran has prepared a, quote, comprehensive plan to respond to any U.S. or Israeli attack. And here's the part that I think deserves a lot more attention than it's getting. The official said Iran's response would include targeting Israeli critical infrastructure and U.S. energy facilities in the region. Did you catch that? They're not just threatening to strike back at military assets, they're threatening to hit U.S. energy facilities too. That means oil infrastructure in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, anywhere America has a footprint. And that's where this whole thing starts to spiral. Because if Iran attacks U.S. energy facilities in the region, then you're talking about a direct hit on American economic interests. You're talking about oil prices spiking. You're talking about global markets reacting. You're talking about the Strait of Hormuz potentially being closed. And let me tell you, the Strait of Hormuz is not just some random waterway. About 20% of the world's oil passes through there. 20%. So when Iran says they prepared a plan, I believe them, because they've been preparing for this for decades. But here's what keeps me up at night. The reports say U.S. officials discussed completing the attacks before markets opened on Monday. They're literally trying to schedule a war around the stock market's weekend close. And I mean, I just have to say it. That's not how you conduct foreign policy. That's not how you conduct military operations. That's how you manage political risk. And that tells me something. It tells me the people making these decisions are more worried about the Dow Jones than they are about the regional war they could be sparking. Here's what the Pentagon said. Sean Parnell, the chief spokesman, said the War Department is in a state of, quote, combat readiness. They're ready to execute any directive the president gives. But when asked about specific targets, he declined to comment. And look, I get it. You don't talk about operational details in public. But there's something about the way this is rolling out that feels orchestrated. Because Trump was at Camp David on Friday. He held a cabinet meeting there. And afterward, he said to reporters, "We'll be hitting them very hard. At some point, they're going to say, 'We just can't take it anymore.'" Think about what that sounds like. At some point, they're going to say, "We just can't take it anymore." That's not a military commander talking about targeting enemy combatants. That's someone describing psychological warfare. You're trying to break their will. But here's the problem, and I want you to think about this. When you hit a country's civilian infrastructure, when you cut off power to its cities, when you destroy its ability to refine its own oil, what do you think happens to the people living there? They get desperate. They get angry. And desperate, angry people don't usually decide to overthrow their government and make peace. They usually decide to fight harder, or they flee, or they starve. And then what? What's the plan for after? Because I haven't heard one yet. Let me pull back and look at the bigger picture here, because I think this is actually where the whole thing gets scary. Iran's Major General Ali Abdullahi said the U.S. is moving at an accelerating pace to fan the flames of a full-scale regional war. And he warned neighboring countries that if they act as a defensive shield for the U.S., they risk getting drawn into it. And you know what? He's not wrong. If the U.S. and Israel launch these strikes, it's not going to be clean. It's not going to be over in a weekend. Iran is going to respond. And their response is going to involve missiles, possibly aimed at U.S. allies in the region, possibly aimed at oil tankers, possibly aimed at Israeli cities. And that's just the first wave. Then what? Does the U.S. escalate further? Do they go after Iran's nuclear sites? Do they put boots on the ground? Do we end up in a war that, honestly, nobody's even voted on? Because here's the thing that bothers me most about all of this. None of these decisions are being made by the American people. They're being made by a handful of people in Washington and Tel Aviv. And the rest of us, we just get to wake up Monday morning and see what happened. Let's talk about the market angle again. I said earlier they're trying to wrap this up before Monday. That tells me they know this is going to affect oil prices. They know it's going to affect the global economy, and they're trying to minimize the damage to us. Not to Iran, to us. Because if oil spikes, Americans pay more at the pump. Inflation goes up. The Fed might have to raise rates. The stock market could take a hit. And in an election year, that's not great for whoever's in the White House. So what do? You schedule your war for the weekend. You hope the markets adjust by Monday morning, and you tell everyone you had no choice. But here's the thing. Multiple White House aides apparently opposed the escalation. They raised objections at the Camp David meeting. So even inside the administration, there's disagreement about whether this is a good idea. Why? Because they know the risks. And look, I want to be fair about something. There's a possibility that none of this actually happens. This could be a pressure campaign. The U.S. could be leaking this to Iran to force their hand at the negotiating table. We'll destroy your energy sector unless you come back and talk seriously. Because the Wall Street Journal did report that if Iran makes immediate progress on the diplomatic front, Trump might pull the plug. So this could be, and I'm not saying it is, but it could be a really aggressive negotiation tactic. But here's the problem with that. If you threaten to bomb a country's power plants and then you don't, you look weak. If you do, you're at war. So it's a lose-lose. Either way, someone's credibility takes a hit. And in the Middle East, credibility is the only currency that matters. Let me talk about Israel for a second. According to reports, Prime Minister Netanyahu presented Trump with 3 military options during their meeting earlier this week. One of them involved strikes on land-based supply routes. Another involved tightening the naval blockade. And the third is what we're talking about right now. Israel has been pushing for a tougher approach. Defense Minister Israel Katz said publicly that he wanted to strike Iran's energy infrastructure. But he also said the U.S. hadn't approved it due to concerns about retaliation. So now, apparently, they're about to approve it. And here's where I think the reporting gets a little murky. Different outlets are saying different things. CBS says Trump hasn't given final approval yet. The Wall Street Journal says he has authorized an offensive. Which one is true? I honestly don't know. And I've been doing this for a long time. But I can tell you what the White House is saying. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, said that Trump asserted during the cabinet meeting that the United States will win and Iran will not have a nuclear weapon under his watch. That's not the kind of language you use when you're trying to de-escalate. That's the language of a president who's committed to seeing this through one way or another. So let me give you my honest read on this whole thing. I think we're at a pivot point. This war has been going on since February. 5 months of strikes, counterstrikes, diplomacy that fails, ceasefires that collapse, and everyone's tired. The U.S. is tired, Israel is tired, Iran is tired. But nobody wants to lose. And that's exactly when things get dangerous. Because when you're tired and you're losing, or you're not winning fast enough, you start doing things you said you wouldn't do. You start hitting power plants. you start planning weekend operations. You start threatening to close maritime straits. And then, without anyone meaning to, you're in a regional war that nobody wanted and nobody can control. Iran has already demonstrated that they can hit back. They've been launching missiles and drones across the region for months. They've targeted tankers. They've struck at U.S. allied energy infrastructure. They've shown that they can cause real damage. And if their economy is on the line, if their power grid is being destroyed, they're going to use everything they have. Because at that point, what do they have to lose? Let me read you something from a senior Iranian official. This is from the Tasnim news agency. The official said, "We consider reports of potential U.S. and Israeli attacks on Iran's infrastructure to be a form of recklessness. Iran has prepared a comprehensive plan to respond." A form of recklessness. I think that's a pretty accurate description, actually. So let me ask you something, and I don't have the answer to this. What is the end game here? Let's say the strikes happen. Let's say they destroy Iran's power grid. Let's say they cripple their oil refineries. Let's say Iran retaliates by attacking U.S. energy facilities in the Gulf, and oil prices spike, and the global economy takes a hit. Then what? Does the U.S. go after Iran's nuclear facilities? Does Israel launch a ground invasion? Does the conflict spread to Lebanon or Syria or Yemen? Does it turn into a war that lasts for years? Because the pattern of the last 5 months suggests that's where we're heading. Each escalation leads to another escalation. Each retaliatory strike leads to a larger one in response. And let me be blunt. I've watched enough of these conflicts to know how they end. They don't end with a clean win. They end with exhaustion. They end with a ceasefire that everyone ignores within weeks. They end with more death, more destruction, and no real change, except that the people at the top have traded places. But I want to step back for a second and think about something else. Why are we hearing about this now? What changed? Well, here's what I think. I think the recent ceasefire collapse in July changed the calculation. The U.S. realized that Iran wasn't going to come to the table. The diplomatic route was dead. So now you either accept a bad outcome where Iran keeps advancing its nuclear program and keeps launching attacks in the Gulf, or you escalate. And escalation is the only option that's politically viable. Because let's be honest, no American president wants to be seen as weak on Iran. No Israeli prime minister wants to be the one who let Iran get the bomb. So you do what you have to do, even if it's reckless, even if it's dangerous, even if it means a weekend of bombs. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The discussion about wrapping it up before markets open. That's the detail that reveals the real priority. They aren't thinking about what happens to Iran's civilians. They aren't thinking about the humanitarian catastrophe. They're thinking about the Dow. And that, honestly, is the scariest part of this whole report. Because if the people making these decisions are more worried about the stock market than they are about the war they're starting, then what else are they willing to do? What's the limit? Where's the line? I don't know. I don't know if these strikes actually happen. I don't know if this is real or if it's a pressure tactic. I don't know if President Trump is going to give the final approval, or if cooler heads in the White House manage to stop it. But I do know this. The fact that we're even having this conversation means something has shifted. The fact that U.S. officials are talking about cutting off power to Tehran, the fact that Israel is reportedly preparing to join in, the fact that Iran is threatening to respond by targeting American energy assets, that is escalation. It's not potential escalation. It's happening right now, whether or not the bombs fall this weekend. So here's where I land on this, and I want you to think about it. This is not an accident. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a deliberate choice being made by a handful of people to take a conflict that was already dangerous and make it significantly more dangerous. And the rest of us, we're just watching or reading or waiting for Monday. But here's what I keep thinking about. If the attacks happen this weekend and they cripple Iran's energy sector, and Iran retaliates in kind, there's no winning that situation. There's only surviving it. And the people who are going to suffer the most aren't in Washington. They aren't in Tel Aviv. They aren't even in Tehran's leadership. They're ordinary people who just want electricity and water, and to see their kids grow up without living in a war zone. I said earlier I'd explain the detail every network missed: the timing, the weekend, the markets. But here's the detail underneath the detail, the one nobody's talking about. This operation, if it happens, is designed to be completed before anyone can react, before the UN can convene, before the markets can panic, before the public can protest. They want to do it fast and quiet. And that's not a sign of strength, that's a sign of weakness. It's a sign they know what they're doing is wrong, and they don't want to be held accountable. So let me leave you with this. The next 48 hours are going to tell us a lot. Not just about U.S. policy toward Iran, not just about what Israel is or isn't willing to do, but about who we are as a country. Whether we're willing to accept this, whether we're willing to let a war be scheduled around the stock market, whether we're willing to cross a line that once crossed can't be uncrossed. This isn't over. I want to be clear about that. Whether or not the bombs start falling tonight, the threat is real. the escalation is real. And the consequences, well, we're going to be living with those for a long time. Let me know what you think about all this down below. I'm genuinely curious where everyone lands. Because honestly, I'm still trying to figure it out myself. And if you want to keep following this, stick around. Because whatever happens next, I'll be here breaking it down, step by step, the way I always do. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again soon.